Gold. Gold upon gold, an entire cathedral made of gold. It dazzles and shines without end, an image of a divine world. The lower half of the basilica, angular, made of stone. The earthly realm with floors and walls made of precious marble. But the gaze of all those who enter is drawn involuntarily upwards to the golden magnificence of the mosaics. At a height of 30 feet, the lustrous glow of the celestial sphere begins. At the bottom, saints from the nearby area link the terrestrial to the celestial sphere. Above them, prophets heralding the arrival of the Messiah. Finally, in the perfect rondure of the vaults and the cupolas, the message of Christianity, the salvation of humanity, a glimpse into the glory of God's kingdom. A staggering space built in one of the richest cities in the world, built to glorify God to whom it was indebted, and at the same time to put its own prosperity on show for all the world to see. Gold, the colour of God and the colour of Venice. Venice, global centre for tradesmen and mariners, once the magnificent final port of call on the Silk Road, the city of canals and palaces that boasted a wealth of fairy tale dimensions. And right in the middle of Venice, the State Church of the Republic, the scene of grandiose demonstrations of power and pomp. With egregious splendour, every detail of St. Mark's Basilica relates something of the history of the city. It's been the soul of Venice for almost 1,000 years, and its facade, like something straight out of the Arabian Nights, is the face of the city. Like the entire basilica, like the whole of Venice itself, it's a unique amalgamation of West and East, Orient and Occident. But how did this fairy tale setting come into being at the heart of a marshy bay off the coast of northern Italy? It all begins with the fall of the Roman Empire, and the Romans on the run. In the year 395, the gigantic empire was divided. The new capital city in the east, on an equal footing with Rome, was Constantinople, formerly Byzantium. The Eastern Roman Empire would exist for more than 1,000 years. It was also later described as the Byzantine Empire. As for the old centre of imperial power, it was being overrun by barbarians, Goths, Huns and Lombards. People fled in panic from the cities out to the lagoon. They felt safe in the labyrinth of sludgy creeks and more than 100 islands. Eventually they founded a city. Its centre became a small island called High Bank, or Rivo Alto, later Rialto. Gradually, the whole of northern Italy was conquered by the Franks, but not Veneto. Around the lagoon, an eastern Roman province persisted. The former refugees maintained this western outpost of the Byzantine Empire. As true Romans, they knew how best to utilize their relations with the East and the unique location of their city. They improved construction of their ships and imported goods from the Orient to Central Europe. This marked the start of an incredible success story that transformed malaria-infested refugee camps into the richest and most powerful trade metropolis in Europe. The patron saint of the young city was Saint Theodore, a brother of Saint George. But then the Venetians decided they wanted a more potent patron, one that would do justice to their burgeoning self-confidence. And they were to receive just that, by way of an audacious theft. The story's been immortalised several times in St. Mark's Basilica. In the year 828, several Venetian sea traders were gathered in Alexandria. Their captains, Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello, had some dramatic news to report. The tomb of St. Mark was in danger. At the time, Alexandria had been governed for more than 100 years by Muslims, who now seemed intent on destroying all Christian houses of worship. Buono and Rustico had heard this in the burial church of St. Mark itself, from priest Theodorus and a monk named Staurazio. The Venetians applied gentle pressure on the two clergymen to bring the saint's remains to safety in faraway Venice. They developed a strategy to smuggle the precious relic past Arab customs officials and conceal the remains beneath a cargo of pork. Muslims view this as impure, and indeed the guards allowed the dubious goods to pass through the checkpoint without inspection. The tradesmen and the saint's remains were given an enthusiastic reception in Venice. The abduction was indeed an ingenious coup. Relics were highly revered in the Middle Ages. This is evident from the collection of more than 100 valuable reliquaries in the treasury of St. Mark's. The relic of St. Mark was highly significant. He was one of the most important saints. Episodes of his life are depicted in several places within St. Mark's Basilica. Historical records identify Mark as a Jew from Jerusalem. The Last Supper is thought to have taken place at his mother's house. After the crucifixion, Mark became an interpreter for the Apostle Peter. The congregation in Rome eventually asked him to create a record of his employer's sermons. The result, some 20 years after the death of Christ, was the first Gospel. Mark's endeavours meant the faithful could read about the life of Christ for the first time. Mark relocated from Rome to Alexandria, which was the spiritual centre of the empire at the time. It was here that he founded what's now known as the Coptic Orthodox Church and became its first bishop. But this was a dangerous position to hold. In the year 68 AD, Mark became a martyr when a rope was placed around his neck and he was dragged through the streets until he died. Some years previously, it's thought that he took a detour through northern Italy on his way to Egypt. According to legend, an angel appeared before him in the lagoon and prophesied to Mark that his body would one day be brought to rest in a magnificent city on the very same site. The Venetians were only too happy to fulfill this promise for him. The famous saint brought supreme divine protection and enormous prestige to the young city. The citizens of Venice would soon regard him as one of their own. After all, he was the one who introduced their forefathers to the Christian faith. The winged lion, the symbol of the evangelist, serves as the omnipresent heraldic creature of Venice to this day. In its paw it holds an open book bearing the greeting of the angel in the lagoon. Pax tibi Marce evangelista meus, peace be with you, Mark, my evangelist. The Venetians were quick to capitalize on the kudos that came with the saint's remains. Thanks to Mark, Venice established itself as one of the most important pilgrimage sites of the Middle Ages, alongside Rome and Santiago de Compostela. The saint was assigned his own church in the centre of the city, right next door to the Doge's palace. This was a clear indication of who was in charge of the lagoon. Although Venice had had its own bishops for 2 generations, they'd all been banished to a church somewhere on the outskirts of the city. As long as the Republic existed, St. Mark's Basilica would never become a cathedral or bishop's seat. There's nothing left of the first basilica. It was engulfed in flames in the year 976 during a Venetian insurgence against the tyrannical Doge Candiano IV. This is a very telling detail. In Venice, the Doge was elected by city noblemen, and a family or a Doge was never allowed to become too powerful. For this reason, an ever more complex political system was formed over the centuries: a senate, a council of elders, a large council, a small council, a council of 40, a council of 10, all keeping one another in check. Before long, the Doge was no longer a ruler, but merely the supreme representative who embodied the greatness of the Republic. His chapel was St. Mark's Basilica, the state church of Venice, a significance that had to be conveyed by its appearance. This is why the Doge Domenico Contarini laid the foundation stone for a completely new church in the year 1063. The basilica destroyed by fire had already been rebuilt and now became the crypt for the new, larger and more magnificent St. Mark's Basilica. We no longer know who Contarini appointed to build the church. Perhaps he was a Greek. In any case, he was very familiar with Byzantine tradition and modelled the basilica on the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. The floor plan is based on a Greek cross, with each arm of the cross the same length and crowned by 5 domes, one over each arm and one over the crossing. But here the longitudinal axis of the cross is accentuated, which is typical of a Western basilica. So even the layout shows the fusion of Orient and Occident that makes Venice unique. The mosaic artists began working while the church was still under construction. They'd go on to make St. Mark's Basilica a truly inimitable creative feat. These artisans also adhered to the Byzantine tradition. The transition from the outside world is made via a vestibule or narthex. The mosaics here depict the creation story and tales from the Old Testament, which in the Bible foreshadow the coming of the Messiah. After this preparation, you enter the church proper and are overwhelmed. High above the altar, an enthroned Christ as Pantocrator, or the All-Powerful, blesses the church. With this figure as focal point, the domes and vaults of the main axis relate the central story of Christianity. The prophets announcing the coming of the Messiah, the life of Jesus up until crucifixion, Ascension, Christ is risen from the dead and saves humanity. And finally, Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit inspires the apostles to take the story of Christ to all nations. The gold not only enhances the splendor of the display, in accordance with Orthodox tradition, it also symbolizes God. Nevertheless, in Byzantine churches, mosaics are individual pictures. Here in Venice, artists were constantly at work on the mosaics, with generation upon generation replacing and adding to the originals. Over the course of 800 years, this resulted in an unparalleled pictorial expanse. A celestial universe covering an area of more than 8,000 square meters, the largest mosaics ever produced in the West. The central mosaics were completed some 80 years after the consecration of the basilica, an event that almost took place without the sacred protagonist. When building work began, the remains of St. Mark were concealed in a safe place. More than 30 years later, both the former Doge and the church warden had passed away, and no one knew where the invaluable relic was. The bishop, the current Doge, and the entire population of the city prayed and fasted for days in total desperation. Then, finally, a miracle occurred. Before their very eyes, the saint himself appeared within a pillar, and indicated the place where his remains were hidden. In this way, St. Mark signalled to the Venetians that he'd become a part of his new church, and they in turn eternalized this miracle in their mosaics. The sarcophagus with the saint's remains was assigned its place at the heart of the church, in the crypt beneath the high altar. And on October the 8th, 1094, the new St. Mark's Basilica was officially consecrated. Venice prospered. The Venetians were not only courageous mariners and canny tradesmen, they were also astute politicians. They didn't kowtow to anyone, not even the Pope or the Emperor. Which is precisely why, when they weren't bickering with them, they could serve as negotiators between the two. In the year 1177, the Venetians organised a historic meeting between Emperor Barbarossa and Pope Alexander III. The Peace of Venice put an end to a decades-long power struggle between the two rivals. The agreement was reportedly sealed with a handshake here in the vestibule of St. Mark's, in one of the greatest diplomatic triumphs of the Middle Ages. Just one generation later, Venice was to finally become the heiress to Constantinople, but this time through use of force. The Europeans had already tried 3 times to win back the Holy Land from the Muslims. As the Fourth Crusade approached, the Venetians were no longer content to sit back and do nothing. They pledged to organize the passage of the Crusaders to Egypt. But in 1202, just 12,000 men turned up in Venice instead of the expected 33,000. A disaster. The Crusaders were supposed to be covering their own transport costs. The Venetians had built more than 200 ships, curtailing their usual business for an entire year. Now the city was threatened with bankruptcy. In order to recoup at least some of their losses, the Venetians convinced the army of Crusaders to conquer the wealthy port city of Zara in Dalmatia first. And from here, they still did not proceed to Jerusalem, but to Constantinople. The city had recently been the scene of some major unrest. Under the leadership of the Doge Enrico Dandolo, the Venetians scented a historic opportunity. They applied their powers of persuasion, and instead of saving the Holy Land, in the year 1204 the Crusaders conquered the world's largest Christian city. The Pope was furious and excommunicated all Venetians, but they weren't bothered in the least. Venice was at the zenith of its power. The former provincial city now ruled its mother country, and the Doge officially became lord of 1/4 of the Roman Empire, according to his new imperial title. Venice controlled the Mediterranean and trade routes with the Orient. The city was located at the culmination of the Silk Road. Tradesmen such as Marco Polo travelled from here to China. The Serenissima Repubblica, or Most Serene Republic as it was known, was the world's most important trading power. Constantinople was systematically plundered. Ship upon ship brought unimaginable treasures back to Venice, gold and silver, as well as the most precious icons, sculptures and reliefs. Naturally, the most beautiful pieces were destined for the state church. This time, instead of the mosaics, it was the overall interior design of St. Mark's that bore witness to the triumph of Venice. The brick walls of the basilica were completely clad in precious marble. The plunderers of Constantinople didn't hold back. Many pieces were taken from the city's venerable churches or directly from the palace of the Roman emperors, such as the pillars next to the main portal. They were only erected here for reasons of prestige and served no architectural function. Although all the pillars and slabs are derived from diverse sources, the overall effect is quite harmonious. This is due to the great skill of the Venetian architects, who carefully matched up the colour and the grain of the marble and paid great attention above all to symmetry. The most precious pillars surround the most holy place of the basilica, the high altar. The altar table has housed the marble sarcophagus of St. Mark since 1837. 4 monoliths support the altar baldachin or canopy. They're also made of marble and adorned with reliefs throughout. 108 scenes are depicted in 324 recesses. Those on the left of the altar relate stories from the life of the Virgin Mary and the youth of Christ. Further episodes from the life of Christ can be seen to the right of the altar, illustrating his teachings and miracles related according to the apocryphal Gospel of Jacob. One of the most remarkable scenes here is that of the crucifixion, which symbolically portrays Jesus as the Lamb of God. As is so often the case with architectural features of St. Mark's, we don't know for sure where the pillars were created, or by whom. Stylistic comparisons suggest that they probably date from around 500 AD in the Eastern Roman Empire, which means they're among the most significant examples of early Christian art. They were, however, altered by Venetian craftsmen and inscriptions added before they were erected here in the first half of the 13th century. Right next to the main altar is the icon of the Madonna Nicopeia. She's the most venerated image of a saint in Venice, and also comes from Constantinople. It wasn't just the interior of the basilica that was designed to tout the power and size of the Republic and glorify its saint protector Mark. The facade, too, was initially made of brick and was completely clad in marble and adorned with pillars after 1204. Treasures looted from Constantinople are again among the highlights of the exterior view, like the Byzantine relief of St. Demetrios, protecting the basilica against the evil of the world. And again, the Venetians combined it with their own work, creating an image of St. George as a counterpiece for the facade of the basilica. The Archangel Gabriel also comes from Constantinople. He's addressing the Virgin Mary, which is again a Venetian piece. The tablet of Hercules with the Erymanthian boar was already some 800 years old when it was installed, an example of how myths of the antiquity were reappropriated in the Middle Ages. The victory of Hercules over the beast was reinterpreted as an allegory of the Redeemer's victory over sin. The main portal is a Venetian masterpiece through and through. The masterful reliefs were created between the years 1250 and 1275. They're the oldest Venetian sculptures embellishing the facade. The prophets appear right at the top. Alongside them, the lagoon fishermen, the shipbuilders, and other representations of ordinary people. Venetians saw themselves honoured here, and their contribution to the city's eminent status acknowledged. They also recognized themselves in the central arch, where portrayals of the 12 months of the year show the everyday routines of working people. Immediately above this, the embodiments of the virtues and beatitudes call for humbleness and decency. Right in the centre are the figures of Satan and lust. Their message was clear to everyone living in the Middle Ages, a reminder of the world's depravity that the devout leave behind once they enter the church. So the facade of the basilica provided citizens with identification, warning, and protection. The most famous treasures looted from Constantinople were very nearly lost. Stored at the Venice armoury for half a century, there were even plans to smelt them down. But just in time, the Venetians realised how valuable they were. The horses of St. Mark. Once a monumental attraction at the Hippodrome of Constantinople, they are to this day the only complete quadriga surviving from classical antiquity. Around 1260, the horses were installed on the large terrace of the basilica. From that moment on, they flanked the Doge whenever he appeared in public, in a stately expression of pride and power. They went on to become the most famous symbol of the greatness of Venice. During the Venetian-Genoese wars, the Genoese did not threaten to tame the Venetian lion, but saddle the basilica's unruly steeds. The horses do indeed lack bridles. This gives them an air of proud freedom, an imposing combination of power and elegance. The material used to create them enhances the effect. The horses are made of almost pure copper. This is more difficult to cast than the usual bronze, but easier to gild. They were even gilded in 2 layers. The figures show how subtly the artist worked. The ridges aren't evidence of damage, but have been deliberately scored to create glistening reflections of sunlight. But again, no one knows who was responsible for the quadriga. People have been trying to guess since the Middle Ages, and attributed the work to the great sculptors of antiquity, Phidias, Praxiteles, and Lysippos. Even today, experts date the piece to anywhere between 400 BC and 400 AD. But the style of the horses suggests that they were created around the year 200 AD, in Rome, but by a Greek artist. The Venetians had their own theories. For centuries they told the tale of a foreign ruler who planned to conquer the city. This ruler threatened to turn St. Mark's into a stable. His plan failed miserably, and as the legend would have it, the horses were placed on top of the basilica as a gesture of scorn. Another legend lives on to this day. Whenever the horses are moved, it's said, an empire falls. Originally cast in Rome, Emperor Constantine took them with him to Byzantium, and the Roman Empire began to dissolve. From there they were brought to Venice, as Constantinople fell. In December 1797, they left St. Mark's for the first time in more than 500 years. Napoleon took them to Paris, marking the demise of the Republic of Venice. They didn't return until 1815, after the fall of the Napoleonic Empire. During World War II, they were dismantled for their protection, and Fascist Italy collapsed. Even 200 years after the end of the Republic that they embodied so majestically, the steeds don't appear to have lost their potency. After a thorough restoration, they visited their distant relatives in Berlin in the 1980s, where the wall fell that very same decade. To the south, St. Mark's received a second magnificent facade. In the 13th century, its centrepiece was still the Porta da Mar, the most important portal leading into the basilica. But there's no evidence of it now. This is because in the year 1501, the wealthy Cardinal Giovan Battista Azen left his entire estate to the city, under one condition, that he received a chapel in the basilica. The city fathers were happy to accept his terms and walled up the portal for the Cappella Azen. Inside, however, the mosaics still testify to the fact that this was once the most important entrance. It was here that the seafarers would enter the basilica direct from their boats and receive a dignified reception by the Mother of God. The 13th century also saw the installation of relief slabs into the walls of the treasury, as well as another famous sculpture that caught the imagination of Venetians for centuries. It was said to portray 4 Albanian brothers brandishing swords at each other in a battle over merchandise. Others saw petrified thieves, Saracens, who stole from state coffers and are out to kill each other out of sheer greed. It's now known that in actual fact the figures represent the tetrarchs, the 4 leaders that collectively ruled the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD. The material itself is an indication of this. The figures are made of porphyry, the most precious of all stones. Because of its purple colour, it was reserved in antiquity for images of gods and the emperor himself. But is this the first tetrarchy of Emperor Diocletian or Emperor Constantine and his 3 sons? This question remains unsolved. One thing, though, is beyond doubt. The tetrarchs were also taken from Constantinople. This was confirmed 40 years ago when archaeologists excavating in the centre of modern-day Istanbul found the left foot lost by one of the rulers. The mosaic above the St. Alypius portal is the oldest original piece on the facade. All the others were replaced in later centuries. It provides an impression of how the basilica must have looked around the year 1260. The tremendous domes were entirely new additions to the building at the time. They owed their creation to the new St. Mark's Square. There'd been a meadow in front of the basilica for decades, and behind it the Rio Batario and a vegetable garden. The rivulet was eventually filled in the year 1156 and paving stones laid on the site. The prestigious Piazza San Marco was born. There was, however, one problem. The domes of the basilica were too flat and couldn't be seen from the new square. So the Venetians added some height, with extravagant external cupolas made of wood and covered with lead. This gave the basilica its unique silhouette. Again, the effect had to be nothing short of magnificent. Now the basilica was about to receive its bell tower too. There'd been a lookout post here for centuries already, from where guards kept watch over the lagoon. This tower was converted in several phases into a campanile. Its appearance has been unchanged since its completion in 1514. The facade of the basilica was made even more resplendent around the year 1400 AD, when it received its Gothic coping. Like a gleaming band of lace, like a coronet of incandescent marble, it was draped around the entire basilica and represented a fantastical fairy tale finishing touch to the facade. Most of the sculptures were the work of Tuscan masters. The 4 evangelists stand protected by small shrines known as ediculas. Beneath each of these, a gargoyle symbolically spouts the wisdom of the gospel over the people on the square below. Warrior saints on the arched tips of the gables defend the city. The highlight is again the main portal, adorned with wildly rampant plants, interspersed with golden-winged angels, and right at the very top of the OG arch, the patron of the basilica and of the Republic itself, with a gleaming gold aureole, St. Mark. The basilica now looked just as it does today, the perfect setting for official ceremonies of the Republic, events of unprecedented pomp. Surrounded by this abundance of gleaming gold, Venice celebrated its own grandeur, such as the procession of the Doge, captured in a painting by Gentile Bellini in the year 1496. In the basilica, the Doge was acclaimed after his election and saw off the captains when they sailed to war, and it wasn't the bishop but the Doge who would appoint the primicerio, the basilica's head priest. The interior was also conceived for maximum impact. The Doge had his own loge, also made of the precious porphyry reserved for emperors. All this may appear somewhat profane to us today, but for the people of the Middle Ages, religion and politics were inextricable. The glamour and the power of Venice and the wealth of the Venetians was all a result of God's grace. This meant that all this munificence was an expression of faith, like a billboard advertising the greatness of God. To foreigners, tradesmen and pilgrims from all over the world, and to the Venetians themselves, the basilica provided them with reassurance that St. Mark was protecting them and that God was on their side. The most important doge during the Gothic era was Andrea Dandolo. Highly educated, a friend of the famous poet Francesco Petrarca, himself a writer, one of the most significant protagonists in the history of Venice. He would also have a considerable influence on the history of St. Mark's. He had the southern section of the vestibule converted into a baptistry, fondly referred to by the Venetians as Chiesa dei Putti, or Church of the Babies. His tomb is also here. Dandolo was the last doge to be buried inside St. Mark's. His greatest contribution was, however, the commissioning of what may be the greatest work of art in the basilica, a piece of incomparable beauty and splendour, the Pala d'Oro. It's one of the most precious altarpieces ever created, 2.5 meters tall, 3.5 meters wide, made of gilded silver and embedded with 250 exquisite enamel pictures and 1,927 jewels. The Pala d'Oro is also a blend of Byzantine and Venetian craftsmanship. The oldest section is the base with its rows of figures. The 12 prophets at the bottom, above them the 12 apostles and the 12 archangels. They bow lower the closer they get to the throne, which has been prepared for the second coming of the Messiah. In the centre, dominating everything, Christ in a gesture of blessing. Surrounded by the 4 evangelists who have written down his teachings, he holds the Holy Scripture in his hand. The letters have been replaced by precious stones, a symbol of the value of the Redeemer's words. Mary, the Mother of God, is below the Saviour. Alongside her, the Byzantine Empress Irene and the Doge Ordelafo Falier. It was he who had this section of the Pala d'Oro made in Constantinople from the years 1102 to 1105. The smaller enamel tablets display celebrations, scenes from the life of Christ and the transportation of St. Mark. The small medallions are the oldest pictures, dating from the year 976. The upper section of the Pala probably came to Venice after the plunderings of 1204. It originates from the venerated Pantocrator monastery in Constantinople. It displays the Archangel Michael in the centre, with further episodes from the life of Christ to the right and left. Andrea Dandolo finally had the individual sections joined together in the year 1343. The goldsmith Giovanni Bonesegna designed the magnificent frame with its innumerable jewels. Thanks to his mastery, a work was created that displayed the spirit of Venetian art in utmost perfection. The only surviving large-scale piece of Gothic goldsmithery in the world. On workdays, the Pala d'Oro was concealed behind an altarpiece known as the Pala Feriale. Andrea Dandolo also had this commissioned from his court painter Paolo Veneziano. Together with his sons, Veneziano created one of his greatest masterpieces. The upper row of wooden panels shows the crucified Christ surrounded by the Madonna, Mark and other saints, again on a gold background and true to the Byzantine tradition. In contrast, the Gothic-style pictures on the lower row relate the story of the transportation of St. Mark to Venice. Veneziano's Pala Feriale is today exhibited at the Basilica Museum. On the reverse side of the Pala d'Oro, a late Gothic painting from the 14th century is displayed. The splendour of the Pala d'Oro was only revealed during High Mass on special occasions, a reflection of God's majesty that outdazzled even the mosaics. In the Middle Ages, its golden brilliance exceeded everything and anything that most people would ever set eyes on. The Gothic masterpieces also include the rood screen. In St. Mark's, according to Byzantine tradition, it's referred to as an iconostasis, although it doesn't actually bear any icons. The sculptures are the work of the Dall'Imasegni brothers, who were well-known sculptors and artists at the time. They signed the iconostasis in the year 1394. The female saints on the side sections were probably created by Pier Paolo Dall'Imasegni and his students. In front of the high altar stand the 12 apostles, the Virgin Mary and St. Mark. They're not looking at the cross but appear to be lost in thought. Their serious faces are characteristic of the work of Jacobello Dall'Imasegni. In the year 1527, the architect and sculptor Jacopo Sansovino was travelling from Rome to Paris. He planned to stop briefly in Venice, but over the next 40 years only left the city a single time. His first commission was to renovate the domes of the basilica. 2 years later, he was appointed to the post of Proto, or chief basilica architect. Over the next 4 decades, he became the most famous architect and sculptor of the Renaissance in Venice. There are examples of his work everywhere, including the wonderful small loggia at the foot of the campanile. His chief responsibility was, however, to embellish the basilica, and this he did like few had done before. He converted the entire choir. The section at the back became the choir proper for the clergy. He made bronze figures of the evangelists for the parapet. And the front section, 2 steps lower, was reserved for the Doge and his entourage, as well as for members of the council. He adorned the 2 lofts with more scenes from the life of St. Mark. Here, Sansovino again celebrated the link between religious and political power. But the general stylistic approach was changing. Images were now highly realistic, inspired by the earthly world. The same can also be said for Sansovino's greatest masterpiece, the bronze door to the sacristy. The lower section shows the entombment of Christ, and the upper depicts the resurrection, also here in dramatic scenes with realistic qualities. The portraits in the door's frame are of particular interest, because thanks to Sansovino's son, we know some of the models he portrayed. The painter Titian, the poet Pietro Aretino, and Jacopo Sansovino himself. An image of the artist himself was completely new. The focus was no longer on an idealized divine realm, but on human individuals. The new system of Renaissance thought had gained the upper hand. "400 years after the consecration of St. Mark's Basilica, changes weren't only making themselves felt in the arts, politically and geographically, the world was also a different place. Constantinople had fallen to the Ottomans, Columbus had discovered America, and Vasco da Gama the sea route to India. The great era of Mediterranean trade was at an end, and Venice was cut off from the oceans. The golden era of Venice had endured for over 500 years. In the Renaissance period, it drew to a close. Still, the Republic continued to show itself off in usual magnificent style in St. Mark's, but it no longer had much political authority. power turned to myth, and Venice transformed itself into a tourist attraction. The famous vedute, or landscapes, painted by Canaletto in the 18th century, were in actual fact intended as souvenirs. Wealthy noblemen and even kings came here to recuperate from the battlefields. This was an oasis of peace, because Venice had slipped into the wings of the world stage. History was now being written by naval powers such as Spain, France, or England. When Napoleon eventually came knocking, what had once been Europe's most powerful city was unable to put up a fight. Exactly 1100 years after the first Doge was elected, Ludovico Manin was the last to hold the position. On May the 12th, 1797, he resigned from his post. Never before had foreign troops entered St. Mark's Square. The Republic of Venice had been brought to its knees. The proudest of its symbols, the quadriga, was taken by Napoleon to Paris. It wouldn't return until the year 1815, when Venice fell to Austria. 2 generations later, the Habsburgs were also vanquished, and in 1866 the Venetians joined the newly established Kingdom of Italy. The end of the Republic also affected St. Mark's. In the year 1807, the church became the bishop's seat. One of the most magnificent and most significant churches in the world was no longer primarily a political status symbol, but exclusively a house of God. These days, the Bishop of Venice resides just next door to St. Mark's. Since the year 1457, he's also held the title of Patriarch, second only to the Pope in the Church's hierarchy. Indeed, 3 Venice patriarchs have served as popes in the 20th century alone. The Procuratoria, or Basilica Administration, is also based in the Patriarchal Palace. This office is responsible for the maintenance and care of the basilica. An incident 100 years ago shows the impact that a single act of negligence can have. On July the 14th, 1902, at 9:47 a.m., the campanile collapsed, burying the loggia of Sansovino beneath it. The authorities had attempted to install an elevator and had removed old masonry anchors in the process. After much bitter discussion, the city fathers decided to rebuild the tower where it was and as it was. And after 10 years, the new tower, restored to its former glory, was unveiled. Today, it's civilization that's taking its toll on the legacy of the centuries. More than 20 million tourists visit Venice every year, and no one leaves the city without visiting St. Mark's. Added to the adverse effects of masses of people comes air pollution and flooding. Floods have always been a fact of life in Venice, but these days water levels rise more frequently and higher than ever before, not least as a consequence of pollution and climate change. These various factors are taking their toll on the unique floors in particular. The distinctive paving is one of the many features drawing so many people to St. Mark's. The slabs cover the entire basilica floor like an endless carpet of precious marble. The techniques originate in Roman antiquity. Large geometric patterns similar to intarsia form the opus sectile. The opus tessellatum, on the other hand, is embellished with lavish plant or animal ornaments, frequently including the peacock, a traditional symbol of paradise and the resurrection. If sections of the flooring ever have to be replaced or renewed, craftsmen still adhere to ancient techniques, with each individual element carved from marble according to the old designs, just as they've always been. In the workshops, it's as though time has stood still. The working methods of the mosaic artists are also no different to those of their ancestors in the Middle Ages. They chip out stone upon stone from coloured glass manufactured by a special company. There is, however, one difference. For centuries, the Venetians renewed the mosaics, each time in accordance with contemporary tastes. These days, no more changes are made, and the mosaic artists maintain the unique artistic legacy of St. Mark's Basilica. Under the supervision of the Proto, a team of craftsmen and scientists is responsible for restoring the building. They've developed some spectacular high-tech methods. What they call restoration from behind, for example, involves tearing down entire walls to stabilize the mosaics from their reverse side. Restoration at St. Mark's has a long tradition, with the first repairs necessary just shortly after the basilica's consecration. In the first 20 years after its completion, the building was afflicted by an earthquake and a major fire. The lateral choir lofts burned down at the time, and since then the nave aisles have been traversed by nothing more than narrow walkways. Yet another detail that bears witness to the history of St. Mark's, which spans more than 900 years. 900 years of pomp and magnificence, but also of piety and gratitude for the greatness of Venice. 900 years in which almost 40 generations of people have devoted their souls to the basilica. During ceremonial high mass, music, architecture and the sparkling mosaics blend in perfect harmony to create a truly divine atmosphere. The Golden Basilica. Not a museum, but the vibrant hub of the city, a source of inspiration for Venetians as well as for visitors from all over the world. Set foot inside St. Mark's and you'll get a sense of power and faith, combined in an incomparable space. The soul of Venice.